Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Nargiza Ludgate and one of the leads of local capacity development cross-cutting team within the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems at the University of Florida. We are very happy to continue our live webinar series funded by the Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems in collaboration with the University of Florida, George A. Smathers Libraries. These series are focused on maximizing your research impact through increasing your scholarly profile and visibility in the digital age, as well as utilize different online free tools that will help maximize your research impact. Today's webinar is about from first draft to published article, navigating the publishing process. This webinar will cover the various steps involved in getting a journal published. The focus will be on the manuscript submission process, including to choose the right journal for your article, submitting the manuscript, understanding editorial decisions, revising the manuscript based on reviewers' comments, and approving final page proofs. Thank you. The webinars are led by Dr. Terry Kit Selfe, who is the Translational Research and Impact Librarian at the University of Florida. Dr. Selfe is an experienced clinical investigator with specific expertise in the planning and execution of clinical trials involving mind-body therapies for chronic conditions related to aging and stress. She received a Doctor of Chiropractic degree from Palmer College of Chiropractic, a PhD in Educational Research from the University of Virginia, and she also completed a National Institute of Health funded postdoctoral fellowship. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. My series started from nowhere. She also completed a National Institute of Health funded postdoctoral fellowships in clinical research at the University of Virginia's Center for the Study of Complementary and Alternative Therapies. Now, before I turn over to Dr. Selfe, I'd like to go over some housekeeping. We request all participants to mute your microphones as you come in and keep them mute throughout the webinar. Please use chat for questions and comments. Please type your name, institution, and email in the chat so we can follow up with you and share the slides of today's presentation. Recording and PowerPoint slides will be also available on our Livestock Systems Innovation Lab's website. We will post a link in the chat. And now for our French-speaking colleagues, we translated the PowerPoint into French. You're welcome to download and use it to follow Dr. Selfe on Zoom. Now I turn over to Dr. Selfe.
Thank you, Nargiza. So as you said, today we're going to be talking about actually navigating the submission process, talking about things that you do on the front end to prepare the manuscript, and then what you can expect during the submission process and the getting reviewers' comments, submitting revisions, all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera as we go through the slide deck here. Okay, so in the last webinar, we talked about the need to publish your study findings. You want to increase the number of people who hear about your research. These types of articles are often referred to as original research articles, as they present new knowledge, data, or information, as opposed to some other types of articles where they're basically interpreting information that's available elsewhere. And I also last time encouraged you to consider other article types like publishing a study protocol or a review article. When you're choosing where to publish, I suggest favoring journals that appear in databases that are used by your audience to help make your article available to them, possibly by making it open access. And I've included links here to publishers that provide content to Research for Life, which is an organization that provides institutions in low and middle income countries with online access to content. And then the other link is for the publishers that discount or waive charges associated with you paying for open access. So today, we're going to move on from choosing a journal and drafting the manuscript, which we talked about last time, to now preparing the manuscript for publication and submitting it. And there's going to be some overlap with some of the resources we've already mentioned. So we'll be revisiting the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors' recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals. But our focus today is going to be on the manuscript preparation and submission recommendations. We're going to be taking a closer look at their general principles, reporting guidelines, and manuscript sections. And I've given the URL on the slide. There are also translations of this recommendations document that are available, and we'll put the URL for those in the chat. Under the general principles heading, they briefly mention the IMRAD structure that we talked about that's recommended for original research articles. Making note that you may also need to use additional subheadings to further organize the content. And they state that other types of articles, like reviews, might need different structures. We'll be revisiting the IMRAD structure under the manuscript sections portion of the document. But first, under the reporting guidelines heading, they point people to reporting standards for guidance in the content that they should include in the article. And again, as we discussed in the last webinar, the guidelines are useful with helping authors to describe the study in enough detail that others can evaluate it. And then ICMJE goes on to suggest the Equator Network as a good resource for finding the reporting standards. Again, that was something we mentioned last time. I've given you the URL for that again here. And remember, we also suggested Meridian as another option, specifically for guidelines for studies involving animals. So now we're going to move on to the manuscript sections that are covered in the ICMJE document. The first section they present is the title page. This page of the manuscript typically includes quite a bit of information besides just the title. As far as the article title itself, this will often include a subtitle that states the study design. And for that, I'd say check your reporting standard, because they often have guidance about this. Consort, for example, I know specifically wants the title to identify the study as a randomized trial. Also, for all of the items that we're going to be talking about, in addition to what ICMJE says, you need to check the journal's specific instructions to authors, because they may differ. ICMJE is providing the overall guidelines, but it will be the journal specific instructions that you want to make sure you're following when you do the submission. There are some journals that want you to include a short title, or sometimes called a running title. And that's something that they use as a header or a footer on every page of the article. So they typically give a character limit, like I've seen something that's common is like 45 characters or 50 characters, including spaces. Then also on the title page, you'll need to list all of the authors, the institutions where they work, and the contact information, at least for the corresponding author. So their email address, a phone number where they can be reached. And ICMJE encourages including your ORCID ID. Again, kind of touching back to one of the other webinars that we did where we were showing you how to get your ORCID ID. And I would say if you don't already have an ORCID ID, get that before you submit your manuscript. You don't want to have to delay the submission process to stop and go into ORCID and create an ORCID ID. You may also need to include some type of disclaimer on the title page, a statement that the views expressed in this article are the authors and don't necessarily reflect the opinions of their institutions or the funding agency, something to that effect. Speaking of which, another item to include is an acknowledgement of any support that you received for the work. And still on the title page, many, if not most, journals want you to include a word count and the number of tables and figures that are included in the submission. The word count, if it's required, is typically just for the main text and does not include the abstract tables, figure legends, references, or acknowledgements. If the journal has set a word limit, I highly recommend trying to stay within that limit. Some journals will give you allow for a little overage on the words, but some adhere very strictly to that limit. For tables and figures, I also recommend try to stay within whatever limit they set. Also, as far as the tables, even if the journal doesn't ask you to include the number on the title page, you might want to include it anyway, because it can help the editorial staff and article reviewers notice if any of the pieces you submitted are missing from what they received. Lastly, ICMJE discusses the need for each author to disclose any financial or non-financial relationships related to the content of the manuscript. This might be required on the title page or in another section of the manuscript, or some journals might have a disclosure form that they want you to complete. And ICMJE has made available a disclosure form that journals can use. And we've provided the URL for that on the slide, so you can take a look at it in advance to get a sense of the types of information they're going to be asking for. So for the abstract, for an original research article, ICMJE recommends those should be structured. And while the specific format will differ depending on the journal, it's very common to see abstracts using the same IMRAD structure that we've talked about. And one point that ICMJE raises is that the content of the abstract sometimes doesn't match what is stated in the text of the article. So be sure that you double check your abstract right before you submit the manuscript, and make sure that it reflects the most current version of the text. Sometimes you've made revisions as you've gone along in the text, and then you forget to go in and update the abstract as well. So be sure to do that. Okay, so now we're back to the IMRAD again. The introduction, methods, results, and discussion sections. And just again, as a recap, we discussed this last time. The introduction is where you give the background for the study and state the purpose of the study. The methods section is where you talk about how the study was conducted and why it was done in that way. All of the information in this section should be available from the study protocol, the plan for the study. The methods section should not contain any information that you obtained while conducting the study. That belongs in the results section. ICMJE also says to include a statement indicating the study was approved by a review body, like an institutional review board or an ethics committee. And this section is supposed to be detailed enough that others could replicate the study. And if you were in the last session, you may recall that I mentioned that's ideal, but with word limits that are sometimes set, that's not always really feasible. So some of the specifics that are required are a description of how the participants were selected, listing the inclusion and exclusion criteria, stating your outcomes and the measures that were used for the assessment. You also need to include the manufacturer's name for any tests or equipment that you used. Precisely identify all drugs and chemicals used. And give references for any established methods. And going beyond that and including a description as well for any methods that are not well established. And finally, here they mention describing the statistical methods, again, with enough detail that someone who had access to the data, obviously, could verify the reported results. As for the results, the data should be provided for all outcomes mentioned in the methods section. You can present it using text or tables or figures. Again, check to see if the journal sets a limit to the number of tables or figures that you can include and present your results accordingly. And the last of the IMRAD sections, the discussion. As we previously discussed, this section typically begins with a brief summary of the main findings and then goes on to discuss your findings as compared to the other relevant studies. Highlight what's important about your study and acknowledge any limitations. Discuss the implications of your findings, addressing both statistical and clinical significance. And again, I want to stress, do not overstate the significance of your findings. Only make statements that are clearly supported by the data. Another part of the manuscript preparation has to do with how references are handled. The ICMJE recommendations say that authors should cite the original research sources rather than review articles. So citing reviews can be more efficient because the review article incorporates multiple relevant studies. However, they don't always accurately reflect the original studies. That's why ICMJE recommends citing the original research. They also give you some language to use when you're describing papers accepted for publication but not yet published, or manuscripts submitted but not yet accepted. They go on to recommend you not cite personal communications or articles published in predatory journals. And we're going to be talking about predatory journals in our next session. As for the style and format of the references, ICMJE recommends the standards described by the National Library of Medicine, and they provide links to helpful resources. Again, be sure to check to see what style your journal says to use and follow that advice. Tables can also be an efficient way to present information. Journals will typically provide specific formatting instructions, so be sure to check for those. Generally, you're going to be numbering the tables in the order that they are first mentioned in the text. And you need to give each table a self-explanatory title so that readers don't have to go back to look at the text for context for what they're seeing in the table. And at the bottom of the table, you're going to explain any symbols or abbreviations you used in that table. As with tables, journals usually provide specific instructions for figures or illustrations. The ICMJE recommendations include the use of high-resolution photographic image files for clinical or diagnostic images, like radiographs, for example, or pictures of pathology specimens. And if you're showing before and after images, they should be taken with the same intensity, direction, and color of light. Now, I want to point out that this is information you need to know when you're designing the study. If you didn't do this when you conducted the study, this isn't something you can fix at the time you're preparing the manuscript for submission. This is just one example of why I think it's so important for researchers to get familiar with the ICMJE recommendations and the reporting standards relevant to their study type early. ICMJE also reminds you to make sure any text that's included in the figure is sized appropriately. Again, just like tables, the figures should be numbered in the order of their position in the text. And finally, if you're planning to include a figure that has been published before, you need to get permission to do that from the copyright holder. So start that process well in advance of submitting your manuscript, as that can sometimes take a while. ICMJE goes on to give some general guidance about units of measurement, again, directing you to the journal for specific instructions. And as for abbreviations, the standard practice is to spell out the term in full the first time you use it, and follow that with the abbreviation that you're going to use throughout the rest of the document in parentheses. In addition to the main text, the tables, and the figures, there may be some other things you need to include. Some journals ask for a cover letter or a submission form. This may include a written acknowledgement that the manuscript you are submitting to them is not currently under consideration for publication in another journal. Any statements regarding authorship or conflicts of interest. And again, contact information for the corresponding author. I would also include the ORCID ID for the corresponding author. If the journal requires the submission of a completed checklist, be sure that you've completed that and include that as well. And again, if you are including any previously published material, you need to send evidence that you've obtained permission from the copyright holder. So as we've looked at the ICMJE recommendations, I've been telling you to also check to see what your preferred journal requires and prepare your manuscript accordingly. So we're going to look at an example. We'll use the journal Livestock Science as this example. For this journal, we'd look at the guide for authors for the information you need. You can see they have information on how to prepare the main text, tables, and figures. And they also address additional pieces you'll need to include with your submission. So this is fairly typical of the type of instructions that journals provide. Here they talk about the margins that should be used, the line spacing, and the order that they want the information presented in. In this case, they say they want any figures or tables to be submitted as separate files, not in the main text. They specify the information to include on the title page. In this case, they want the full postal address for each author, as well as their email address, if available. In my experience, many of the journals I've dealt with have required the email address and didn't necessarily need a postal address. So again, just reiterating, check the journal-specific instructions. And the corresponding author, this seems to be the only one that they are requiring an email address for. This is, if you're not familiar with the term corresponding author, this is the person who's responsible for all of the communications with the journal, as well as the person who's going to be fielding any future questions from readers in the event the manuscript is published. For the abstract, Livestock Science doesn't specify any headings to use for the abstract. They tell you a bit about what it should include, but they don't provide a structure. In a case like this, I typically look at some of the articles that have recently been published by that journal to see if there is any kind of consistent format to their abstracts, and just follow that. This journal does set a word limit for the abstract of 400 words in this case. And be aware, for some manuscript submission systems, what you need to do is enter the abstract into a text box in the system. And sometimes that text box only accepts the number of words they allow. So if you tried to enter 403 words for your abstract, it's only going to accept the first 400. So the instructions they give about tables are pretty representative of what I usually see. They want the tables to be editable. They don't want them inserted as images. They want the tables to be numbered in order of appearance. You've heard that a few times already. And they don't want them to be redundant with what's already been described in the text. And something I found interesting, the instructions that they give about the placement of the tables seems to contradict what they said earlier. Here, they say the tables can be either next to the relevant text in the article or on separate pages at the end. Whereas previously they said that they needed to be uploaded as separate files. And for this journal, the information on figures is under artwork. They give some general points like suggested fonts, numbering according to appearance in the text, making sure to size the figure close to what you want it to be in the published version. Here, they are consistent to what they said earlier about placement. They say to submit each illustration as a separate file. And then they also go on to give more detail about acceptable formats and minimum resolutions. For example, using TIFF or JPEG files for color photos, and keeping those to a minimum of 300 dpi. So again, just very, very reflective of the types of instructions you will typically see. And as I mentioned, some journals require a cover letter. I didn't see that requirement for livestock science. So I've included a different journal example here. They not only do they require a cover letter, but they go on to give the specifics about what all needs to be included in that cover letter. So back to the livestock, excuse me, back to the livestock science example. They do require a statement of the author's contributions, and they suggest a format to use. They require a disclosure of any financial support, and that should include what, if any, role the sponsor played in the study design or the writing of the manuscript or the decision about what gets published. You'll often see this information presented at the end of articles. And this journal also requires submission of a separate declaration of interest form, where all authors disclose any relationships that could bias the work. And this is another common requirement. Sometimes it will be a separate form that needs to be submitted. Some journals only require this type of statement be included somewhere in the manuscript typically toward the end, sometimes on the title page. Also, something to be aware of when you're getting ready to submit your manuscript, some journals require you to submit the names and email addresses of some potential reviewers. So you want to get that together before, you don't want to start your submission, you think everything's going fine, and then it's like, oh no, I've got to think up some potential reviewers and find their email addresses. So just know that in advance that might be required. Check your journal to see if that's something you're going to need to be including as part of the submission. And know that the editor won't necessarily invite those reviewers to review your manuscript, but they do typically then add them to a list of potential reviewers for future use. When you're ready to start the submission process, make sure you've got the final versions of all of the pieces. And I suggest titling them in a way that you can easily identify them as the item you submitted. Like in the file name, calling it final or submitted. Remember to check for anything that might be required in addition to the text, tables, and figures, like the cover letter, names, potential reviewers, any forms they require. And the submission process frequently involves uploading each of the pieces into their system. Then they combine all the pieces into one PDF that you will then need to approve to finalize the process. Don't just automatically accept the PDF once it's created. Actually, you do need to check it because sometimes pieces get missed or formatting errors occur when they turn it into the PDF. So do look through it to make sure it's right. Paying close attention to the formatting of the tables. In my experience, they seem to be more prone to formatting problems if they're going to occur. And my advice is, for this whole process, allow yourself way more time than you think it's going to take. Sometimes it can go quickly, but if there are problems or delays, it's much less frustrating if you've allowed yourself extra time. So once the submission is finalized, you'll generally get a confirmation email. Sometimes that goes to all of the authors listed. Other times, the journal only emails the corresponding author. And if that's you, you might want to notify your co-authors of the submission. In the event that you are a co-author on a manuscript someone else submitted, be alert to any emails that are notifying you of a submission and see if there's anything that you need to do, like acknowledge your authorship or submit a form, so you don't delay the process. So once you've completed the submission, the editor will take a look at the manuscript and decide whether it fits the aims and scope of the journal and whether they should go ahead and send it out for review by your peers. They'll generally solicit reviews from 2 to 3 reviewers. And then based on those reviews, the editor will decide next steps. Some of the common responses from editors include accepting the manuscript as is, accepting it if the author makes some minor revisions, informing the author the manuscript might be accepted if they were to satisfactorily address some major concerns, or rejecting the manuscript outright. If you get an email saying the manuscript requires revision, in addition to making the suggested changes to the text itself, noting the changes that you make either by highlighting them or using track changes in Word. You typically also need to write a response letter where you address each of the reviewer's comments and telling them how you handled those in the text. You might not always agree with all of the reviewer's comments, and you don't have to do everything they suggest. Sometimes they get it wrong, but you will need to provide a strong rationale for any decisions not to change something. Also, know that comments can sometimes be hard to take. So you might want to give yourself some time to process them and have an objective colleague read your response letter to make sure it's tactful. And the manuscript might need to go through multiple revisions before you get to a place where you get an email from the editor saying it's been accepted for publication. I suggest saving that email so that you know which was the final accepted version and the date it was accepted. You sometimes need that date when you're filling out a progress report or your annual evaluation, or you might want to note it in your CV. So at this point, the journal production team is going to go to work on formatting the manuscript as it's going to appear in the journal. You'll then be asked to check this version for errors, and sometimes they'll have specific questions that they need you to answer. At this stage, it's typically a short turnaround time. Often they want a response within 48 hours of you getting that final version. And then sometimes once that's completed, the article may be published soon thereafter, or the publication can still be months away. That's going to depend in part on how frequently the journal publishes. Does it come out monthly, quarterly? And some journals will tell you at that final stage, like the anticipated date for publication. So just to recap, we talked about using the ICMJE recommendations as general guidance for preparing your manuscript for submission, always referring to the journal's specific instructions, and then some ideas of what you can expect at different stages of the manuscript submission process. So that is all I had for content. I do have a slide showing you the upcoming webinars in the series, and we can open it up for questions at this point.
Thank you, Terry, very much. Anna, would you like to take from here and help
Yes.
us wrap up the seminar?
Yes, thank you so much to all the listeners. We are getting to the end of today's webinar. I would like to thank our presenter, Dr. Terry Selfe, for such an engaging topic and content. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to see you in future webinars.